1944. Two Japanese professors stood frozen at the entrance of their Texas POW camp library, staring at hundreds of books their own government had banned and burned, books their captors were now freely offering to enemy prisoners. Back home, Japanese students were being arrested for reading foreign literature, yet here they were, enemies of America, being given uncensored access to Shakespeare, Kant, and even contemporary philosophy that criticized democracy itself. What did these professors discover in those books that shattered everything they believed about civilization, power, and which side was truly free? In the spring of 1942, Professor Takahashi taught literature at Tokyo Imperial University, one of the most respected schools in all of Japan. He stood before his students each morning in a dark suit, teaching them the approved books, the safe books, the books that would not get anyone in trouble. On his desk sat only the texts the government allowed. The other books, the Western books, the dangerous books that asked too many questions, those had been taken away 2 years before. Some were burned in the campus courtyard, while students watched in silence. Professor Takahashi had watched too, his face blank, his hands folded, saying nothing because speaking meant prison or worse. Down in Kyoto, Professor Nakamura taught philosophy in much the same way. He had once loved the great thinkers from around the world, the men who asked hard questions about truth and freedom and what makes a good society. But now he taught only what was safe. He taught that Japan was superior, that the emperor was divine, that Western thinking made men weak and selfish. He said these words even though something inside him wondered if they were true. But wondering was dangerous. Thinking different thoughts was dangerous. Even in his own home, he kept his real questions locked away in his mind where the thought police could not find them. The government controlled everything by then. Every newspaper printed the same stories. Every radio broadcast repeated the same messages. America and Britain were evil, they said. Americans were barbarians who cared only about money and machines. They had no culture, no honor, no real civilization. Japanese children learned these lessons in school. Japanese workers heard them in factories, and Japanese professors like Takahashi and Nakamura taught them in universities, whether they believed them or not. Paper became so rare that publishers stopped printing new books. The paper went to the war effort instead, to propaganda posters and military orders. Libraries removed books from their shelves, especially books that came from enemy countries. Owning an English novel could bring police to your door. Reading American poetry could cost you your job. The government said this was necessary, that dangerous ideas must be kept out, that Japan must stay pure and strong. In 1943, both professors received orders to serve the military. They were not soldiers, but the army needed men who understood foreign languages and foreign thinking. Takahashi was sent to help with translations. Nakamura advised officers on Western philosophy so they could understand how the enemy might think. Neither man wanted to go, but refusing an order from the military was impossible. So they packed their few belongings, said goodbye to their families, and went where they were told. By 1944, both men found themselves in the Pacific, far from their classrooms and their books. The war was not going as the newspapers claimed. Japanese forces were losing ground. American ships and planes seemed endless. And then one day, after an attack on their position, both professors became prisoners. They were captured along with other Japanese soldiers and officers, their hands bound, their faces showing no emotion because showing fear meant dishonor. They expected to die. Everyone in Japan knew what happened to prisoners. The military had told them again and again, never surrender, because the enemy will torture you and kill you slowly. Americans were savages, they said. Americans would humiliate you and make you suffer. Death in battle was better than capture. This is what Takahashi and Nakamura had been taught, what they had helped teach others. But they did not die. Instead, they were put on a ship, then a train, and finally they arrived at a prisoner of war camp in rural Texas in the autumn of 1944. The journey took weeks. They barely ate. They barely slept. They waited for the beatings to start, for the torture the military had promised. Other prisoners whispered fears in the dark. Some shook with terror. Some prayed to die quickly. When the gates of the camp opened, the professors saw rows of wooden barracks painted white, not the dark cells they imagined. They saw grass and trees, not torture yards. American guards pointed them toward their building, speaking words they did not understand, but not shouting, not hitting. The professors walked slowly, waiting for the trap to spring, for the cruelty to begin. Inside the barracks, they found metal beds with mattresses, thin but real, not dirt floors where prisoners sleep in their own filth, not chains on the walls, just beds in rows, and windows with glass and a stove for heat. Professor Nakamura stood perfectly still, his mind unable to match what he saw with what he expected. This had to be temporary, he thought. The real prison must be somewhere else. On their second day, an American officer came to speak to them through a translator. He explained the camp rules. Work details would be light, he said. Meals would come 3 times a day. Medical care would be provided. And then he said something that made both professors look at each other in confusion. He said there was a library, a room with books, books they could read. Professor Takahashi felt his heart beat faster. Books? Here? In a prison camp? It made no sense. The translator must have made a mistake, but the officer pointed to a building across the compound and said the library was open in the afternoons. Prisoners could check out books if they wanted, any books on the shelves. That afternoon, Takahashi and Nakamura walked to the library building. Their legs felt weak. Other prisoners walked past them to other buildings, to meal halls and work assignments. But the 2 professors only wanted to see if the library was real. They reached the door. It was unlocked. They pushed it open and stepped inside, and both men stopped breathing for a moment. Shelves lined the walls. Hundreds of books filled those shelves. Real books with cloth covers and printed pages. Books in English, books in German, and there on one shelf, books in Japanese. Professor Takahashi walked slowly to the shelf that held Japanese books. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the spines. He pulled one book free and held it carefully, like it might break or disappear. It was a collection of classical Japanese poetry, the kind his government had approved. But next to it sat another book, and when he saw the title, his breath caught in his throat. It was a novel that had been banned 3 years ago, a story about a man who questioned the war. Takahashi had owned this book once. The police had taken it from his home, and he never saw it again. Now, here it was, in an American prison camp, on a shelf where anyone could read it. Professor Nakamura moved to the English section. He read English well from his years of study before the war. His fingers traced along the titles. Shakespeare was there, all the plays he had taught from memory because the books themselves were forbidden. Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, complete editions with notes and introductions. He pulled down Hamlet and opened it. The pages were clean and new. The book even smelled new, like it had just come from a printer. In Tokyo, paper was so rare that people wrote on the backs of old posters. Here, enemy prisoners were given fresh books. On the next shelf, Nakamura found philosophy books. His whole body went still. There was Kant, the German thinker whose ideas Japan had declared dangerous. There was Plato from ancient Greece. There was John Stuart Mill from England, writing about liberty and freedom. All the books his university had removed from the library, all the ideas his government said would poison Japanese minds, they were all here on these shelves in Texas. An American guard sat at a desk near the door. He was young, maybe 20 years old, reading a magazine. He looked up and saw the 2 professors staring at the books. He smiled and said something in English. The professors did not understand the words, but his voice was friendly, not cruel. He pointed at the books and made a gesture like opening a book and reading. He was telling them they could take the books. They could borrow them and bring them back later. Takahashi chose 3 books that day, the banned novel, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, and a book about American history he had never seen before. Nakamura took 2 books, both philosophy, both forbidden in Japan. They signed their names in a ledger at the desk, just like in a normal library in a normal city in a time of peace. The guard stamped a card and handed the books back to them. No questions, no suspicion, just books. That night in the barracks, Takahashi read by lamplight until his eyes burned. Other prisoners played cards or wrote letters or slept, but he read. He read the novel he thought he would never see again. The words were the same words he remembered, but now they hit different. The story questioned whether the war was right. It asked if loyalty meant following orders or following truth. In Japan, asking such questions out loud meant prison. Here, the Americans gave this book to their enemies. The next week, more surprises came. The camp had a newspaper printed in Japanese. Prisoners could write articles about life in the camp. They could write about their thoughts and feelings. An American officer reviewed the articles, yes, but he only removed things that might help an escape or give away military secrets. Everything else stayed in. One prisoner wrote a poem about missing his home. Another wrote about the strange American food. Another wrote comparing Japanese and American farming methods. The officer approved them all. Professor Nakamura discovered something even more shocking. The camp allowed discussion groups. Prisoners could meet and talk about books, about ideas, about anything that was not escape plans or military information. He joined a group that met twice a week to discuss philosophy. German prisoners came too, and some Italian prisoners who spoke enough English or German to follow along. They sat in a circle in the library and talked about truth, about justice, about what makes a government good or bad. An American guard stood outside the door. But he did not come in. He did not write down names. He did not report what was said. One day in December, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. He was Swiss, neutral in the war, checking that prisoners were treated fairly. He brought boxes of books, new donations from American universities. The boxes held fresh publications, books printed just that year. There were novels and history books and science books. There was also a new translation of a contemporary American philosopher writing about democracy and freedom. Nakamura held this book and felt dizzy. Back home, university students were arrested for owning books like this. Here, enemy prisoners received them as gifts. The meals kept coming, 3 times a day. Not much meat because of wartime rationing, but bread and potatoes and vegetables and sometimes fruit. Clean water whenever they wanted it. Coffee in the mornings, weak but hot. No one was starving. No one was beaten. The work details were light, just cleaning the barracks or helping in the kitchen or maintaining the grounds. Nothing like the slave labor camps Japan ran in China and Korea. Nothing like the brutal treatment Japan gave to prisoners. Professor Takahashi started keeping a secret diary. He hid it under his mattress and wrote in it late at night when others slept. He wrote about the books. He wrote about the food. He wrote about how the guards treated them like humans, not like animals or devils. And he wrote questions that scared him. If these Americans are barbarians, he wrote, then what are we? If this is how they treat their enemies, how do we treat ours? He thought about the Chinese prisoners he had seen in Japanese camps, starving and beaten. He thought about the Filipino workers forced to build roads until they died. He pushed these thoughts down deep, but they kept rising up. Winter came to Texas and the camp got cold at night, though not as cold as Japan. In early December, an American officer made an announcement through a translator. Starting next week, the camp would host a lecture series. Professors from a nearby university would come to teach the prisoners. Anyone who wanted to attend could attend. The lectures would cover many subjects, including history, science, and philosophy. Professor Nakamura felt his chest tighten when he heard this. Enemy prisoners getting education from American teachers. It seemed impossible, like a dream that made no sense. The first lecture happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the camp's main hall. About 30 prisoners came, mostly officers and educated men like Takahashi and Nakamura. A white-haired American professor walked to the front of the room. He was old, maybe 60, wearing a brown suit that looked worn at the elbows. The translator stood beside him. The professor smiled at the prisoners and began to speak about American democracy, about how the government was built, about the ideas behind the Constitution. Professor Nakamura listened carefully. He expected propaganda, the kind of speeches Japan forced people to hear about how great the emperor was. But this professor talked differently. He explained that American democracy came from many sources, from Greek and Roman ideas, from English law, from French philosophy. He talked about how the founders argued with each other, disagreed strongly, but found ways to compromise. He even admitted that America had failed to live up to its own ideals in many ways. He talked about slavery, about how it took a terrible war to end it, about how Black Americans still faced unfair laws and treatment. Then the professor did something that made Nakamura's mind stop working for a moment. He opened the floor to questions, not fake questions where everyone already knew the safe answer. Real questions. A German prisoner stood up and spoke in English. He pointed out that America claimed all men were equal, but American laws separated black and white people, gave them different schools and different water fountains and different places to sit on buses. How could America call itself free when it did this? The room went silent. Nakamura expected the professor to get angry, to have the German punished for such disrespect. But the professor nodded slowly. He said the German was right. He said this was America's great shame and failure. He said many Americans were fighting to change these laws, but change came slowly, too slowly. He said democracy was not perfect, that it was messy and full of arguments, and sometimes it failed badly. But the system allowed people to speak up, to protest, to push for change without being shot or imprisoned. Nakamura felt something crack inside his chest. This American professor just agreed with an enemy prisoner's criticism of America. He admitted his country's faults in front of foreign soldiers. In Japan, even hinting that the emperor or the government might be wrong meant the secret police would come for you at night. Teachers who questioned official policy lost their jobs or disappeared. But here, this professor stood in front of enemy prisoners and said, "Yes, my country is flawed. Yes, we have done terrible things. Yes, you are right to point this out." That night, Nakamura could not sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the dark ceiling, while other men snored around him. His whole life he had taught students that Western democracy was weak because it allowed disagreement and criticism. He had taught that Japan's system was strong because everyone moved together with one purpose under one leader. But now he saw the truth backwards. Japan's system was so weak that it could not survive even one question, one doubt, one person thinking differently. It needed police and prisons and fear to hold it together. America's system was strong enough to let people argue and criticize and disagree, even during a war, even with enemy prisoners. He thought about his students back in Kyoto, young men who had trusted him to teach them truth. He had taught them lies, not because he wanted to, but because teaching truth meant death. How many of those students were dead now, sent to die in a war they could not question? How many had killed and died believing they fought for a superior civilization, when really they fought to protect a government too frightened to allow its own people to think? Professor Takahashi had his own breaking moment a few weeks later. Christmas came, and American families sent gift packages to the camp. The packages held small things like soap and socks and chocolate. But some held books. Takahashi received a used copy of Shakespeare's plays, a complete collection with a worn cover. When he opened it, he saw writing in the margins. Some American student had owned this book before and had written notes throughout. Questions, arguments, places where the student disagreed with Shakespeare or with the teacher's interpretation. On one page, next to a famous speech, the student had written, "But is this really true? What about poor people who can't be noble?" Takahashi stared at these notes for a long time. In Japan, writing in a book was almost criminal. Books were sacred objects to be respected and preserved. But more than that, questioning the text was not allowed. The teacher explained what a passage meant, and students memorized that meaning. There was one correct interpretation, approved and official. But this American student had argued with Shakespeare himself, had questioned whether the great writer was correct, and the teacher had not punished this. The student had kept the book, probably got a good grade, gone on to college. The wisdom in the books was not just the words the authors wrote. Takahashi suddenly understood. The wisdom was in the freedom to disagree with those words, to think about them, to question them, to make up your own mind. Japanese education gave students conclusions to memorize. American education gave students questions to wrestle with. The war ended in August 1945 when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prisoners heard the news through the camp radio, translated into Japanese. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself spoke on the radio for the first time ever, telling his people the war was over. Some prisoners wept, some sat in silence, some felt relief. Professor Takahashi and Professor Nakamura felt mostly shame, hot and heavy in their chests. They had been safe and fed in Texas while their cities burned and their people starved. It took almost a year for all the prisoners to go home. Ships had to be arranged. Papers had to be processed. During those months of waiting, Takahashi and Nakamura spent every day in the library. They read everything they could, trying to fill their minds with knowledge to bring home. The American guards let them keep some books as gifts when they finally left. Takahashi wrapped his Shakespeare collection and his American history book in cloth and tied the bundle with string. Nakamura packed philosophy books, including the one about democracy that had changed everything for him. These books were more valuable than gold to them. In the autumn of 1946, both professors finally boarded a ship bound for Japan. The journey took 3 weeks. They stood on the deck as the ship pulled into Tokyo Bay and saw their homeland for the first time in years. The city looked like a nightmare. American bombs had destroyed whole neighborhoods. Buildings stood like broken teeth. Rubble filled the streets. People looked thin and tired, wearing patched clothes, walking with heads down. This was what winning civilization was supposed to look like, Takahashi thought bitterly. This was the superior culture Japan had promised. Takahashi went home to find his house still standing, but damaged. His wife had survived. His 2 children had survived. But they were thin, so thin their bones showed through their skin. Food had been scarce for years. His wife cried when she saw him, holding him tight, asking over and over if he had been tortured, if he had suffered. He held her and said nothing because the truth was too complicated. How could he tell her that he had eaten better as a prisoner than she had as a free citizen? How could he explain that his captors had treated him with more dignity than his own government treated its people? His son, now 12 years old, asked him quietly one evening what the Americans were really like. The boy had been taught in school that Americans were demons, monsters who ate children and destroyed everything they touched. Takahashi looked at his son's thin face and felt anger rise up. Not at the boy, but at everyone who had lied to this child, including himself. He told his son the truth. He said the Americans were people, just people, some good and some bad, like anywhere. He said they had libraries full of books and they let their prisoners read whatever they wanted. He said they fed their enemies when their own country went hungry. The boy listened with wide eyes, trying to understand how everything he had been taught could be so wrong. Professor Nakamura returned to Kyoto to find his university in ruins. The main building had burned. The library where he once taught was just ash and broken stone. But the greater ruin was in the minds of the people. A whole generation of students had learned to memorize instead of think, to obey instead of question, to fear ideas instead of explore them. Nakamura stood in the rubble and made a decision. He would spend the rest of his life fixing this, teaching people how to think again. Both professors went back to teaching as soon as the universities reopened, but they taught differently now. Takahashi organized his literature class in a circle instead of rows. He asked students what they thought about the poems and stories, not what the approved interpretation was. When students gave the old memorized answers, he pushed them. He asked why. He asked if they agreed. He asked them to argue with the text. The first few months, students sat in confused silence. They had never been asked to have their own opinions before. Slowly, carefully, they began to try. Nakamura fought to add protections for academic freedom into Japan's new constitution. He wrote letters to the occupation authorities. He met with Japanese officials. He argued that democracy could not work if people were not free to think and learn and question. His experience in the Texas camp had taught him this. A country that feared questions was a country that feared truth, and such a country would always be weak no matter how many soldiers it had. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. The students who learned to think and question from Takahashi and Nakamura became teachers themselves, then leaders, spreading the new way of learning. The 2 professors stayed in touch, writing letters back and forth, sharing their progress and their frustrations. Both kept their American books on special shelves in their offices. Students would sometimes ask about them, and the professors would tell the story of the library and the prison camp. In 1968, Nakamura wrote his memoir. He was old then, his hair white, his hands shaking when he wrote. He told the whole story of his time as a prisoner, of the library, of the lectures, of the moment he understood that his whole life before had been a lie. He wrote that being captured by Americans was not when he became a prisoner. He had been a prisoner long before that, a prisoner of his own government's fear, of propaganda, of enforced ignorance. The Americans had not captured him. They had freed him. The book ended with a thought that had stayed with him for more than 20 years. The real wisdom in those camp library books was not written on the pages. The wisdom was in the fact that the books were there at all. The wisdom was that even in war, even with enemies, The Americans believed human minds deserved freedom, and truth needed no guard.